Hey everybody, in today's video we're going to be taking a look at the new Nikon Z6III. I've been in the incredible position of being able to use the Nikon Z6III for the past almost 4 months. I first received my first Nikon Z6III in early March, and since then I've been able to take this camera around the world. Whether it's places like Cape Town or the Farne Islands off the coast of the UK, I've used the Z6III for almost every type of photography, whether that's wildlife, landscapes, portraiture and sports. And alongside this Nikon Z6III, the second body in my camera bag has been the Nikon Z8. So we'll talk about some of the things that I like about this camera, some of the things that I don't like, there are some. We'll talk about how I feel it sits against the Nikon Z8 and the Z9, and we'll also talk about how it sits against the Nikon Z6II. First things first, let's talk about what's on the inside of the Z6III. Well, the headline specification is that it contains the world's first partially stacked imaging sensor. We've seen stacked image sensors before in the Z8, the Z9. We've also seen non-stacked imaging sensors, like in the Nikon ZF that I'm filming on right now. But this is a partially stacked sensor, which sits somewhere between the two. It's not quite a fully stacked sensor, it's not quite as fast of a readout as you'll find in the Z8 and the Z9, which is why the Nikon Z6III has an electronic shutter and a mechanical shutter, but it is certainly a faster readout than a non-stacked or non-partially stacked image sensor, which means that the Nikon Z6III's readout is much faster than what you would see with the Nikon Z6, and also much faster than you would see with even the Nikon ZF. In fact, the Nikon Z6III's readout speed is about 3.5 times faster than what you would get from a Nikon Z6 II. Clearly though, because of that mechanical shutter, it's not as fast as the Nikon Z8 or the Z9. The mechanical shutter exists for the use of flash. So if you're wanting to use the Nikon Z6III with flash, and you don't want to have any flickering effects whilst using flash, the mechanical shutter still exists in the Nikon Z6III, which I think is a really important point to keep in the back of your mind. That 24 megapixel sensor does have an optical low pass filter. It's not the same 24 megapixel image sensor that we've seen before. This is a new 24 megapixel partially stacked imaging sensor. I do appreciate that there were a lot of people that wanted to see the Z6III have a megapixel bump to get closer to the 45 megapixels of the Z8 and the Z9. But I feel like Nikon have gone for the compromise between the two, giving you 24 megapixels, which is more than enough for most things really, but then giving you the ability to have a much faster readout because of being partially stacked, and also then the ability to be cleaner at higher ISOs in camera, especially when it comes to video recording, and also less concerns when it comes to storage size and space. I just also feel like that because Nikon have had a 24 megapixel count camera for a long time in lots of different iterations, that this is one of the best 24 megapixel cameras I've seen. And it's hard to explain, but just looking at the image quality, and I kind of felt the same way about the ZF. When I look at the image quality of my ZF, it doesn't look like a traditional 24 megapixel count camera. It looks nicer than that. It looks sharper, it looks more detailed. So there's a lot of other stuff going on than just the megapixel count would suggest, but I've really been impressed with the image quality. Sure, if I'm in a situation where my subject is further away and I need to crop in further, the Z8 would still retain more detail because of the 45 megapixels as opposed to 24. Being a high megapixel count photographer normally with Z8, am I disappointed in the image quality of the Z6III or disappointed that it's 24 megapixels? I don't think so, and I think it's a really good accompaniment to a 45 megapixel camera. The second headline feature for the Nikon Z6III is one of the features that really stands out to me, and that's the viewfinder. I cannot stress this enough. The viewfinder on the Z6III is noticeably better than the Z8 and the Z9. They already have good viewfinders. No one's ever said to me that they don't like the viewfinder of the Z8 and the Z9. Everyone seems to be really happy with the performance they get out of the Z8 and Z9 viewfinder. But the Z6III's viewfinder clearly takes that a step above. It is the best viewfinder that Nikon have ever made. You have an increased resolution of the viewfinder, so it's the highest resolution viewfinder that Nikon have ever put into a mirrorless camera. You also have an increase in brightness. The Z8 and the Z9 were already the world's brightest viewfinders, and now the Z6III is the world's brightest viewfinder, surpassing that of the Z8 and the Z9. And then we also have the ability to display up to P3 color. This is again another first for viewfinders. But the brightness advantage isn't always an obvious one, and I still get lots of photographers that ask me about why is Nikon making the viewfinders so bright? What's that big advantage? And there's a couple that are instant advantages for me. The first one is when I'm shooting outdoors. So when I'm shooting outdoors, when it comes to things like wildlife and landscapes, when I'm using that viewfinder following a subject, or I'm following a bird in flight, for example, I shoot with both eyes. And this is something I've spoke about before, but what I'm doing is I'm using my right eye through my viewfinder and I'm using my left eye to look at the end of my lens. My left eye is effectively my wider field of view. So if I lose the subject with a long focal length lens, my left eye can pick the subject up and I can line it back up again. It's a really great way of being able to keep following and tracking a moving subject like a bird in flight. But now we can take that even a step further. Those of you that are shooting in even brighter conditions. That also then goes hand in hand if you're shooting with tinted goggles or if you're shooting with sunglasses, because you don't have to take the sunglasses off. You can still look through the sunglasses and the viewfinder is bright enough to kick through those sunglasses and still show you the detail in the viewfinder. When it comes to blackout in that viewfinder, the viewfinder is blackout free under certain circumstances. As you would have guessed, if you're using the mechanical shutter, something is physically moving in front of your sensor, then the viewfinder does have a blackout. But if you use the electronic shutter, and when using the extended high frame rate, you do get a blackout-free viewfinder experience, which isn't quite the same as the dual stream technology that you get on the Z8 and the Z9, but it is a very good experience when using the electronic viewfinder, and it is effectively a live view in front of you. This is going to be particularly useful for wildlife and also for sports. Now, when it comes to frame rates, the Nikon Z6III can shoot at up to 120 frames per second. That'll be DX cropped, and it is a JPEG file, so that's a 10 megapixel JPEG file. You can shoot 60 frames a second and 30 frames per second at full frame JPEG file, but 24 megapixels. So 30 and 60, 24 megapixel full frame. When it comes to RAW files, the fastest you can shoot with RAW files is 20 frames per second. So this will do 20 frames per second with an electronic shutter in a full RAW file. If you use your mechanical shutter, that does drop down to 14 frames per second. But still full RAW, still full image quality. It's just entirely up to you whether you want to use a mechanical shutter or the electronic shutter. I have done some memory card tests. Now, I found out very quickly that memory card tests when using a CF Express card was completely pointless. When using a CF Express card with stills photography, there's no buffer, there's no limitation. You can shoot forever, basically. That includes RAW files, lossless compressed RAW files, RAW plus JPEG. The camera just keeps shooting. However, when you use a SD card, as you would expect, the SD card does mean that you will end up hitting the end of your buffer, and that happens around 100 frames if you're just shooting RAW, and it happens around 81 frames if you're shooting RAW and JPEG, which is still an awful lot, and that's what I mean by you can get away with using SD cards in most situations, but if you need to absolutely have zero buffer, that's where you would use a CF Express card to do that. When it comes to the design of the Nikon Z6III, it borrows a lot of design choices from the Z8 and the Z9. It's still going to be familiar to those of you that have used Nikon Z series cameras in the past, but there are some button placement that's changed around based on Z8. The first one's going to be the placement of the playback button. The playback button is now in the bottom right rather than the top left, like it was in the Z6 II. And on the top of the body, we still have the traditional video recording button, ISO, and then exposure compensation, and then 2 dials front and back. And then function 1 and function 2 on the inside of the grip. We now have a new illumination button on the top of the camera. This just illuminates the top plate screen. It does not illuminate the buttons. The Z6III does not have illuminated buttons, unfortunately. We also have the mode dial that we're used to seeing on the Z6 II, Z7 II, for example. And this brings with it U1, U2, and U3. I am a big fan of these user modes. Those user modes allow you to completely create your own collection of settings and quickly switch into them on the dial, so I like the return of those user modes. In terms of ports on the outside of the camera, we have a mic input, we also have a headphone input, and then we have a USB-C and a full-size HDMI port as well. That USB-C can be used for charging or for direct power whilst you're filming or whilst you're recording. It does not have two USB-C ports like the Z8 does, so that's one thing to be aware of, but you can still continuously power or charge the camera via USB-C on the left-hand side of the camera. We have two memory card slots on the right-hand side. We have a CF Express / XQD, and then we also have an SD card slot. Quite noticeably, the Z6III does not have the left-hand side focusing button. So both the Z8 and the Z9 have that focusing button on the left-hand side of the camera body, which the Z6III does not. But there's lots of other ways that you can ask the camera to change its focusing settings. More importantly, one of the biggest requests that a lot of people asked for in the Z6II was the ability to assign a focusing area to a button. You can now do that in the Z6III because it uses the same menu system as what you would find in the Z8. So it's brought over a lot of those additional customization options. It doesn't have everything. It doesn't have recoil shooting functions, for example, but you can assign a focusing area to one of the function buttons, so you can quickly switch from auto area to single point, for example. It also makes use of the same battery as most Nikon cameras now, so the same as the ZF, the Z6II, the Z7II, the Z8, it all makes use of that ENEL15C. So if you've got lots of those batteries, it will take that same battery. And that brings me on to one of the things that I really just don't understand about the outside of this camera. I don't know if it was an intentional thing. I don't know how it's happened. Because of where the camera strap lug is placed, every time you open the memory card door gets stuck on the lug. And that means that it's not quite open enough to get a memory card in and out. And especially if you're trying to get a CF Express card in and out, the memory card door's in the way. On other cameras, like on the Z8, there's a little cutout. The door's got a little cutout, which means that the door passes under the lug. And on the Z6II, the door passed underneath the lug because the lug was positioned higher on the camera body. Every time I just went to use the memory card door, it always gets stuck on the strap lug. Maybe that's a problem for me because I don't use camera straps. For those of you that use camera straps, maybe it means that it pulls the lug out of the way and then it's not a problem. Also, you could obviously just remove this little anchor point. Then it won't get caught in the way of the memory card door, but still, it's just one of those things that when I get my own Z6III, I will just take that bit off because I don't need it. The Z6III can also be used with a grip. This is very similar to the grip that we've seen with the Z8 and with the Z6II, but it will not let you use the Z6II's older grip, and you can't use a Z8 grip. You have to use the grip that is specifically designed for the Z6III, so keep that in mind. The grip allows you to take two batteries, so two batteries go into the grip. This will then go into your camera body, so effectively increasing your battery life by adding another battery into the grip. You can also hot swap those batteries as well, which is nice, which is the same as the other Nikon grips, and you can use this as a charger. You can charge both batteries in the grip via USB-C. The grip has a small function button on the top of it, a lock switch, two dials, an AF on button, and then also a autofocus toggle. So most buttons, but not all of the buttons are replicated like they are on the Z9's built-in grip. Now, when it comes to the screen on the Nikon Z6III, you have a flip-out, fully articulating screen, so you can rotate it round to the front to record yourself, and you can also rotate that underneath, so that if you wanted to shoot over a crowd or something, you can use the screen to do that. Personally, I don't like this type of screen. I much prefer the type of screen that you'll find on the Z8 or the Z9, which is fixed to the back of the screen but then allows you to flip out horizontally or vertically. I much prefer this screen setup. Now, everyone obviously has their own idea about what the best screen for them is, but the reason I don't like this screen is because it's never in the right place. There's lots of people out here that do like this type of screen, but it's not for me. I would have much preferred the Z8 or Z9 screen. All right, let's talk about the big one. Autofocus. Autofocus is an important part of any camera, and how has the Z6III's autofocus system changed? Well, it's a completely new autofocusing system. Because of the X-Speed 7 processor, because of the partially stacked imaging sensor, this autofocus system is much faster. It's significantly faster than what you would see in a Z6II, and it's almost equivalent to what you would get from a Z8. The Z6III can do 120 AF calculations per second, which is the same as the Z8 and the Z9. And it also borrows the same focusing areas like 3D, auto area, and wide area custom 1 and 2. You can customize your own size and shape, And in fact, in those custom areas, you have way more choice than you do in the Z8 or in the Z9. It also borrows the same subject detection options as well. Whether you want to use the camera to detect for people, animals, vehicles, aeroplanes, those subject detection options are built into the camera. You can use the Z6III and it will recognize all different kinds of animals, including birds, and it will also recognize people and vehicles. One important point to note about its bird recognition and animal recognition. The Z6III can recognize birds. It knows what a bird is. But the one thing that might confuse people, or the one thing that you might see that's different from the Z8 and the Z9, is that they both have a dedicated bird subject detection option. That dedicated bird subject detection option does give the Z8 and the Z9 a specific bird focusing setting. And I'm sure there'll be lots of people out there that get a little bit confused, and I'm sure there'll be someone that will say that the Z6III can't focus on birds. It can. It knows what a bird is. But currently, right now, its bird detection is built into the animal detection, which to some people is a benefit and to other people would be seen as a disadvantage. The benefit would be if you're photographing wildlife, you might be taking pictures of birds and other animals, so you want your camera to be able to detect birds and mammals and so on. The downside is that if you're just exclusively photographing birds, then the Z8's bird detection option means the camera is only looking for birds, it's looking for small birds in the frame. I expect that will change with firmware depending on when you're watching this video. So in terms of that autofocus performance, as I mentioned, it has all the areas, it has all the subject detection, and it has the same calculation rate of the Z8 and the Z9. Now I have really good examples of how good this camera is able to autofocus on fast moving subjects, especially very fast birds in flight, for example, and I've been really happy with its performance. I do think that in maybe 1% of the time the Z8 or the Z9 might act differently, or the setup might be slightly different, but I feel like this is 99% of the focusing system that you get in the Z8 and the Z9, and has allowed me to capture some incredible sequences of moving subjects, birds in flight, and the images that I'm showing you now, or the sequences that I'm showing you now, are just full straight out of camera sequences following that subject as it's flying towards me, as it's moving around, using a mixture of different focusing options. So the auto-focusing system of the Z6III is a massive step up over what it was in the Z6II, and now it's way more in line with the Z8 and the Z9. Now, when it comes to video, the Z6III is not just a stills camera. The Z6III has just as many video features as it does stills features. And in some cases, some people might think that the Z6III is actually more of a video camera than it is a stills camera, apart from the way that it's built and what it looks like from the outside. So what are those headline video specifications? The Nikon Z6III can shoot up to 6K in 60 frames per second in RAW internally, directly to your memory card. You do not need an external recorder. You can also shoot 4K at 120, and you can also do 1080 at 240 frames per second. 1080 at 240 frames per second is even something that the Z8 and the Z9 cannot do. So that 1080 at 240 is a first for Nikon Z series cameras. You have the choice of being able to shoot in NRAW format, ProRes RAW format, ProRes HQ, or just H.265 10-bit files or 8-bit files. In NRAW you can do 6K 60, 4K 120, 4K 60. In ProRes RAW you can shoot up to 6K at 30 frames per second or 4K at 60 frames per second. In ProRes HQ you can shoot 5.4K at 30 frames per second, 4K at 60 frames per second, and 1080 at 120 frames per second. At H.265 for 10-bit, you can do everything. You can do 5.4K at 60 frames per second, you can do 4K at 120, you can do 1080 at 240. The only option of all of those resolutions and frame rates that is cropped is 4K 120. 4K 120 is cropped to DX. Every other resolution is at full frame. So 6K, 60 frames per second, full frame, RAW internally, but 4K 120 is cropped to DX, which is that 1.5 times crop. The crop exists so that the camera doesn't have to do any pixel binning. It gives you a full pixel readout at 1.5 times crop, which is a higher quality pixel readout rather than it being at full frame and then not giving you as good quality. I've also done some tests around overheating. Now, we definitely aren't having one of our hottest summers here in the UK, so I can't test this in extreme heat conditions right now, but I have tested it for long periods of time in Cape Town and also done some tests here in the UK, and I've not had any issues with overheating, but just to show you some of the results that I've found when recording video and overheating. Here we have the Nikon Z6III recording in 6K at 60 frames per second in NRAW and in Nlog, and it's recording all of that to the memory card. The memory card is a CF Express 650GB Delkin Black memory card, and originally this was designed to be a overheating test, but it very quickly became a battery life test. The memory card allows me to record for 22 minutes at a time, so you will see me format the memory card quite a few times. I format the memory card 4 times, and the camera continues to record for a total of 1 hour and 45 minutes. It stops recording because the battery dies. I do not get any overheat warnings. I don't even get a memory card heat warning. Remember, memory card heat warnings are just letting you know that your memory card might be hot when you remove the memory card from the camera. A memory card heat warning is not the same as a camera overheat warning, but I don't get any heat warnings, memory card or camera heat warnings. None of them appear. I don't know what magic is going on here, but in this situation, in this scenario, in this ambient temperature, the Z6III recorded 6K at 60 frames per second in RAW for 1 hour and 45 minutes without overheating. Now, as I mentioned previously, this is not in the world's hottest environment. My ambient temperature started at around 18 degrees Celsius, and then by the time that we finished, it had dropped a couple of degrees as the sun was setting. But this is still indoors, it's not outdoors with a breeze or moving wind to cool the camera down either. It's worth noting that the camera did certainly get warm, and the screen is still flipped back, so the screen's not open to let the back of the camera cool down. The memory card door is closed, the battery door is closed, so I'm not trying to cool the camera down in any other way, shape or form. I'm sure that in other circumstances where the temperature is much higher, then you would start to see overheat warnings, but in this scenario, or in mild temperatures, the Z6III can record 6K 60 frames per second from 100% battery for an hour and 45 minutes. If I was to power the camera or use another battery, then the camera would obviously keep recording beyond that as well. What I'd love to be able to do would be to take the insides of this camera and just put it into a box, and I can then put all my attachments on it, all of the connection points. That would be a great idea. A couple of other things that are worth mentioning about the Z6III. It does have pixel shift, so if you ever want to shoot up to 96 megapixel images, you can do that in the Z6III. The Z6III also makes use of Nikon's new RAW formats. This is something that we've seen in the Z8, the Z9, and in the ZF, and that means that you now get the lossless compressed RAW format, followed by the high efficiency star raw format, and then just the high efficiency raw format. This is different to what we've seen in the past with compressed raw, lossless compressed raw, and then even uncompressed raw files. The Z6III will give you the choice of lossless compressed, high efficiency star, or high efficiency, the same as the Z8 and the Z9. And most Z8 and Z9 users are pretty happy with that high efficiency star raw files. They give you fantastic quality and still give you a much smaller file size. Now, there is one final feature that kind of involves the Z6III, and I really wanted to talk to you about this feature because I'm in a pretty unique position of being able to use that feature, and I was really impressed with how it works. Unfortunately, all I can say is that the Nikon Imaging Cloud service is coming soon, and I can't tell you any more details than that right now, but I'm really excited by that cloud service, and from what I've seen, it's going to be a pretty useful feature. I've genuinely been impressed using this camera over the first few months. It hasn't missed a beat. It's done a lot better than I was expecting. I was expecting this to be not as good as the Z8 or the Z9, and I was definitely expecting to wanting to reach for my Z8 over the Z6III more often than I did, but I was actually pleasantly surprised, and this is a camera that can compete in most situations, especially if you're a photographer that wants a low resolution megapixel count, fast frame rate, fast autofocus, and good high ISO performance. So I do think this camera could be used as the main camera for sports and for wildlife and for photojournalism as well. It all comes down to whether 24 megapixels is right for you or not. Do make sure that you subscribe to this channel so you don't miss out on all the information around that Nikon Imaging Cloud and any other information that I put up about the Nikon Z6III and all of the Nikon Z series cameras really. Thank you so much for watching. I hope that you found this video useful. If you have any questions, please do ask in the comments below, and I will see you all very soon. Goodbye.